Lily Hartman's disappearance was not just another missing persons case. It was the crack that shattered Riverside's perfect image, pulling her family, her neighbors, and her entire town into a chilling web of secrets they were never meant to uncover. Riverside was the kind of place that seemed almost too good to be true. Tidy houses lined the streets, with freshly painted shutters and trim hedges that gave the neighborhood a picture-perfect charm. Children rode their bikes in cul-de-sacs, while neighbors exchanged polite greetings on front porches. To an outsider, Riverside was the definition of safety and simplicity. But on a humid summer evening in 2012, that image cracked. A call came into the local police station reporting a missing teenager, 16-year-old Lily Hartman. She had been at her best friend's house earlier in the day, laughing, studying, and planning the rest of her summer. When she left just before sunset to walk the 5 blocks back to her home, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet she never made it there. At first, no one panicked. Teenagers went missing all the time, or at least that was what the police told themselves. Maybe she had gotten distracted, stopped to talk with a friend, or decided to spend the night elsewhere, without informing her parents. But when hours passed and Lily failed to answer her phone, worry began to spread. By midnight, her parents were calling everyone they knew, retracing her steps, and begging neighbors to check their yards and garages. Still, there was no sign of her. The following morning, the search became official. Police canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to residents who might have seen her on her walk home. Yet strangely, not a single person remembered spotting Lily after she left her friend's front porch. Security cameras from homes and businesses in the area were checked, but none showed her passing by. It was as though she had stepped off the curb and vanished into thin air. What made matters even more unsettling was that her personal belongings remained untouched in her room. Her wallet was still there, her clothes still folded neatly in the dresser, her schoolwork stacked on her desk. If she had run away, she had left without taking anything at all, which made no sense. By the end of that first week, Riverside no longer felt like the safe community it pretended to be. Parents who once let their children roam freely now kept them inside. Windows were locked, doors double-checked, and whispers filled the air. Some neighbors claimed to have noticed a white van parked at the edge of the street that night, one they hadn't seen before. Others spoke of a man standing alone on the corner in the days leading up to Lily's disappearance, though none could recall his face. The stories didn't match, but the unease was growing. For the Hartman family, life had collapsed into a nightmare. Lily had been their youngest child, the one who filled the house with noise and energy. Now the house was silent, filled only with the sound of police radios and investigators questioning them again and again. Every detail of their lives was examined, every conversation with Lily replayed, but no clear answers emerged. The case that had started with a simple missing persons report was beginning to feel like something much more complicated. Behind closed doors, the officers assigned to the investigation admitted their confusion. Cases like this usually left behind some sort of trail, a sighting, a message, a clue that could point them in the right direction. But with Lily, there was nothing. The neighborhood's cameras had all failed to capture her. Her phone had been turned off the moment she stepped outside, and no one could agree on what they had seen. It felt orchestrated, almost deliberate, as though someone had gone to great lengths to make her disappear without a trace. In Riverside, where nothing bad was ever supposed to happen, people began to ask the questions no one wanted to hear. If Lily could vanish in such a carefully planned way, was this really the first time? And if someone was responsible, how close to home were they willing to look? The perfect image of the town was cracking, and the darkness underneath was just beginning to show. The search for Lily stretched on, but the longer it went, the stranger everything became. Investigators followed the obvious leads at first, knocking on doors, reviewing camera footage, and questioning anyone who might have been in the area that night. But none of it added up. It was as if Lily had been swallowed by the street itself. Her footprints, faint in the dust near the sidewalk, stopped abruptly halfway down the block. They did not lead toward a car, a house, or even the grass. They just ended, leaving officers staring at an empty patch of pavement with no explanation. Theories spread through Riverside like wildfire. Some residents whispered that Lily must have run away, though her belongings still at home made that hard to believe. Others were convinced she had been grabbed by someone driving through town, a predator who waited for the perfect moment to strike. What unsettled the town most, however, were the details that simply didn't make sense. One family swore they saw a white van parked at the corner the night Lily disappeared, but when pressed for a license plate number or any description of the driver, they came up empty. Another neighbor claimed to have seen a man leaning against a streetlight earlier that week, but when asked to describe him, the only answer was vague: a tall figure, maybe wearing a hat, maybe not. Every potential lead blurred into uncertainty. Like smoke slipping through fingers, days turned into weeks. Fear replaced curiosity. Parents who once let their children play freely outside now pulled them indoors the moment the sun set. Some installed new locks and motion lights, others bought guard dogs, and conversations with strangers were cut short out of suspicion. The police urged patience and insisted the case remained open, but behind closed doors, officers admitted frustration. Each clue seemed to vanish the moment they pursued it. Even the official case files showed signs of interference. Reports went missing from desks, witness statements were misplaced, and records from Lily's phone provider were inexplicably erased before investigators could secure them. The Hartman family felt this pressure more than anyone. Each day reporters camped outside their home, demanding answers they didn't have. Each night the unanswered questions weighed heavy on them. Why had Lily's phone gone dark the exact moment she left her friend's porch? Why were there no sightings of her anywhere in town? And most disturbingly, why did it feel as though someone was deliberately removing the threads that could lead to the truth? By the third week, whispers started to spread beyond Riverside. Online forums picked up the story, with strangers speculating about hidden connections. Some pointed to similar disappearances in neighboring towns, cases labeled as runaways but never resolved. Others suggested the possibility of an organized effort to keep people silent. Though unproven, the theory spread quickly. This wasn't just a random abduction, it was something carefully planned, and someone with influence was making sure the details stayed hidden. Tension in the community reached a breaking point. At town meetings, residents demanded answers, asking why a teenager could vanish under such mysterious circumstances without a single clear lead. Officials responded with rehearsed reassurances, promising the investigation was active, but their words felt hollow. Families who had once felt secure in Riverside now questioned everything about their safety. The longer Lily remained missing, the clearer it became that this case was different. It wasn't just the lack of evidence, or the confusion of unreliable witnesses. It was the growing sense that someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, erasing details, silencing voices, and ensuring that every path led to nothing. What began as the disappearance of one teenager was turning into something much larger, something that hinted at a pattern hiding in plain sight. The town that had always been proud of its peace now carried an invisible weight. No one said it aloud, but the thought was on everyone's mind. Lily was not the first, and unless the truth came out, she would not be the last. Nearly 6 months passed before the investigation into Lily's disappearance took a sudden and unexpected turn. It happened on a cold November morning when a hiker stumbled upon a weathered backpack deep in the woods, more than 20 miles away from Riverside. At first, he thought it had been discarded by a camper, but when police opened it, they discovered school books neatly stacked inside, a wallet with Lily Hartman's identification, and a crumpled scrap of paper with numbers scribbled across it. The items were worn from exposure, but they were unmistakably hers. For the first time in months, investigators had something tangible, though the discovery only deepened the mystery. The torn piece of paper was what caught their attention most. At first glance, it seemed meaningless, a string of dates, written hastily in pen. But when investigators cross-checked those dates, they were shocked to see they aligned with other missing persons cases in the surrounding counties. One date matched the disappearance of a college student 3 years earlier, another lined up with a teenage runaway who was never seen again, and others linked to names long forgotten, cases that had been brushed aside and quietly closed. It became clear that Lily's disappearance was not an isolated tragedy. Instead, it fit into a chilling pattern. Digging through old police records revealed something even more disturbing. For nearly a decade, a young woman had vanished from the region almost every year. Some were labelled as runaways, others as accidental drownings or unsolved crimes, but none had ever been solved. Families had pleaded for answers, filing reports and begging local officials to take the cases seriously, yet each one had faded into silence. Now, with Lily's backpack tying her to that same pattern, investigators realized the possibility of a larger, hidden threat that had been operating under everyone's noses. But uncovering this trail wasn't easy. Many of the files investigators needed were missing, destroyed, or incomplete. Phone records had been erased, police reports had gone unfiled, and in some cases, evidence collected from other victims had simply vanished. It was as though someone had been systematically scrubbing the history of these disappearances. Journalists who tried to connect the dots ran into walls of resistance, with officials denying any link between the cases. Yet the paper in Lily's backpack, scrawled with dates no teenager should have known, told a different story. Families of other missing girls began coming forward, sharing their own frustrations with law enforcement. They spoke of ignored calls, unanswered letters, and detectives who stopped returning their messages once cases went cold. One mother described how she had been warned not to push too hard if she wanted to be left alone. Another father claimed he had been followed after giving interviews about his daughter. At first, these accounts sounded like paranoia, but stacked together they painted a picture of deliberate silence, a system that wanted to keep the truth buried. The revelation shook Riverside. What once seemed like an isolated tragedy had turned into a grim suggestion that the town and its surrounding communities had been living under a shadow for years. If Lily had been one in a long line of disappearances, then the question wasn't just who had taken her, but why so many people had worked to keep that knowledge hidden. The quiet town now carried the weight of a possible predator, or perhaps a network, that had operated freely while everyone looked the other way. The backpack, instead of providing closure, had opened a door to something far more terrifying. Investigators now had proof that Lily's disappearance was tied to something larger, but every attempt to follow the trail brought resistance. Requests for files were denied without explanation, access to evidence was blocked, and even officers assigned to the case began to admit privately that they were being told not to dig too deep. It was no longer just a missing persons case. It was a story of obstruction, secrecy, and power. As the Hartman family clutched their daughter's belongings, others began to recognize the possibility that their own loved ones had been silenced in the same way. What began as grief was slowly turning into anger. For years, people had been told their daughters had left by choice or vanished without reason, but now it seemed those explanations were lies meant to cover something darker. The discovery in the woods was both a breakthrough and a warning. The truth was finally beginning to surface, but it was clear someone had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden. And the question lingered heavily over Riverside. If the dates pointed to the past, what would they reveal about the future? The deeper investigators pressed into the mystery, the more resistance they encountered. The discovery of Lily's backpack had sparked a renewed sense of urgency, but it had also triggered forces determined to keep the truth buried. At first, the obstacles were subtle: misfiled documents, unreturned phone calls, conflicting instructions from higher authorities. Soon, the interference became impossible to ignore. Detectives working the case confided off the record that they had been told to focus on other priorities. Journalists chasing leads reported that their editors received warnings to drop the story. It became clear that this was not just about missing girls anymore. This was about power. The dates scrawled in Lily's paper had pointed toward a grim history of vanishings, but when investigators attempted to reopen those old cases, they found doors slammed shut. Police reports that should have been preserved were missing entirely. Photographs from crime scenes had vanished. In one instance, an evidence locker that was supposed to contain clothing from a victim had been emptied with no record of removal. Each gap felt deliberate, as if someone had gone through the archives with careful hands, erasing anything that tied the disappearances together. Amid the mounting frustration, a whistleblower finally stepped forward. A former city employee claimed that the missing girls all had connections, however distant, to a controversial development project on the outskirts of Riverside. The project, which aimed to transform farmland into a sprawling commercial district, had been the subject of bitter debate in town meetings years earlier. Families were pressured to sell their land, and those who resisted often found themselves harassed or financially cornered. The whistleblower insisted that Lily, along with several of the other girls, had relatives who had opposed the development. It was a link that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The name that surfaced repeatedly in these conversations was that of Victor Dane, a wealthy businessman with deep roots in Riverside. He owned much of the land tied to the project, and had poured money into local politics, ensuring his allies held key positions in government. To the public, he was a philanthropist, funding parks, schools, and community events. But beneath that polished image was a reputation for ruthlessness. People whispered that those who crossed him often regretted it. If the whistleblower was correct, the disappearances might have been a chilling tool of intimidation, targeting families who threatened his ambitions. Yet even as suspicion grew, bringing Dane into the spotlight proved impossible. Journalists who wrote about him claimed they received anonymous calls warning them to stop. Families of victims reported seeing unfamiliar cars idling outside their homes late at night. One detective who tried to pursue the development angle abruptly requested a transfer, and within days his files disappeared from the department's database. It was as if an invisible hand was scrubbing the truth clean before it could be made public. For the Hartman family, the revelations were almost too much to process. They had believed for months that Lily's disappearance was a random act, a tragedy that struck out of nowhere. Now they were confronted with the possibility that she had been targeted, not because of anything she had done, but because of forces far beyond her control. Their grief began to harden into fear, and then into a quiet, simmering anger. The town itself seemed to exist in two layers. On the surface, Riverside continued its routines. Children went to school, businesses opened their doors, neighbors waved politely as if nothing was wrong. But underneath was a suffocating tension, an unspoken awareness that someone powerful was shaping what could and could not be said. Those who dared to ask questions too loudly often found themselves silenced, whether through intimidation, disappearance of evidence, or the quiet withdrawal of support from officials. The case had grown into something far larger than one missing girl. It had become a battle between truth and control, between families demanding answers and forces determined to bury them. Every small revelation was met with swift suppression, as if the closer investigators came to exposing the truth, the more dangerous it became. The shadow hanging over Riverside was no longer just suspicion. It was the presence of something organized, calculated, and willing to destroy anyone who threatened its secrets, and in the midst of that shadow, Lily's absence remained the most painful reminder of all. The question was no longer just who had taken her, but how many others had been lost to the same silence, and how far those in power were willing to go to ensure the town's perfect image was never disturbed. Just as the investigation seemed poised to break open, everything collapsed. Files that had been painstakingly collected over months disappeared overnight from police storage. Case notes, photographs, even the scrap of paper found in Lily's backpack, all gone. The official explanation was a clerical error, a transfer mix-up, but those close to the case knew better. It was too precise, too selective. Only the evidence that threatened to connect Lily to the larger string of disappearances had vanished. It felt like a message: stop looking.